The God of War Ragnarok script has leaked in full. Originally, it was posted in the subreddit GOW Spoilers. So that's r/GOW Spoilers. It immediately got taken down. It was up for about 15 minutes as a paste bin, and someone also had a link to the Google Docs. I snagged a copy of the Google Docs version myself. I've read over it a few times, and I'm thinking the reason it was taken down so quickly is because it is legitimate. Now, the God of War Reddit and the God of War communities on YouTube are very divided about this. Some people believe it's completely legitimate. Other people believe it's fan fiction. I personally, after reading this, believe it is legitimate, and I think that specifically it's legitimate because of what difference it has when you would think about what you would expect from a God of War sequel. There's a lot of differences in the 2018 God of War versus what's in God of War Ragnarok's script, and I think that was intentional. I think they are trying to subvert expectations a little bit because they don't want to just make the game that everybody thinks they want them to make. Sony Santa Monica want to do something a little bit different. They've always been about that. But I don't want this to be too much about my opinion. I want the script to be the focus of this video. So we're going to do highlight bullet points. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'll have a link to it down in the description below. But God of War Ragnarok script, first off, the game opens with a narration kind of recapping the events of the 2018 God of War. They're not doing God of War 1, 2, 3, 4. They're trying to keep them, in the series, obviously, there's callbacks to the continuity, but they're not actually numbering them. So there is a recap of the events that happened in the 2018 God of War with Atreus and Kratos. The game actually opens with a cinematic picking up exactly where the secret ending of God of War 2018 left off, with Thor arriving at Kratos and Atreus' house. And this is actually where the player first gets control of the character. The boss fight with Thor actually doesn't end up being a boss fight so much as it is kind of just a tutorial on how the combat mechanics work. It's a flashy but very button prompty sequence. There's not a whole lot of gameplay there. But this is where the story really starts to take a turn. At the end of that initial boss battle, all right, it's actually revealed that Thor's not going to be the main antagonist of God of War Ragnarok like myself and so many others were thinking. What they're actually doing is Thor joins forces with Kratos, and he actually pals around with him and Atreus throughout the majority of the game. And when the main graphic flashes up on the screen, you'll see why they did this. It's because it's a very different turn than what most God of War fans would expect. It's not called God of War Ragnarok. They're calling it God of War 2.5 Gods. So it's Thor, Kratos, and Atreus, who's actually now voiced by Charlie Sheen, walking around Midgard. So what happens is it's revealed through a series of plot points that Atreus is not actually Kratos' son. That's a huge revelation, but it actually comes about a third of the way through the game. Basically, Kratos, after getting his initial family killed back in the original God of War, has been in the closet. He's a homosexual. And part of this entire story arc is about him coming to terms with who he is and embracing and admitting his love of Thor. Those two have not so much flirtation, but rather just these little nuanced kind of looks they'll give each other at certain plot points. And they, it's not suggestive, but they like lock eyes and they hang for a moment or two too long. Anyway, let's get back to the story because I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So Freya is actually the antagonist of this game because she tries to seduce Kratos after that initial tutorial with Thor, and Kratos refuses her advances. And after discovering that he is, in fact, a homosexual god, at that point, Freya, who had initially forgiven Kratos for the murder of her son Balder, decides she's going to rain down hellfire and destroy Kratos because he wouldn't give her the D. All through this, Kratos is essentially having to give the birds and bees talk to Atreus, who is actually Loki, but we don't know that yet. The two characters that I'm referencing don't know that yet. And also come to grips with the fact that his father is a homosexual. Now, that's not to say that there's no traditional God of War staples here. There is absolutely a massive boss fight, but it does not come until the end of the game. So I just want to let you guys know there is something here for you guys if that's what you're really about. but the majority of the game is actually much more in the vein of like Heavy Rain. All right, so the combat is pretty scaled back. Like, it's much more of like a walking simulator. They were already kind of going in that direction in the prior entry, but now they've pretty much gone full David Cage with Heavy Rain. You're essentially walking around making choices and dialogue that all lead to the same outcome. So you're flirting with Thor, and when you're not flirting with Thor, you're giving the birds and the bees talk to Atreus, and when you're not flirting with Thor or giving the birds and the bees talk to Atreus, you're essentially destroying everything that the first game set up. And this was intentional on the designer's part. This was absolutely intentional. So any of the clues that were set up with like that giant snake actually being Kratos in the future, that's completely destroyed. Remember that giant boss fight that I mentioned? You actually fight the giant snake about halfway through the game. It's actually not great as far as God of War boss battles go, but it is there, and it does actually have a pretty cool set piece at the very end where you chop the snake's head off. Basically, Thor's on one side, Kratos is on the other. Thor has Mjolnir, and Kratos has his Leviathan axe, and they like come together in this devastating blow, cutting the snake's head off. It's actually kind of epic to see it, and I don't want to lie to you guys, but the way it's described in the script, I really want to see this on the screen. So that's handled. Freya's coming for you. You kill the snake because the snake will tell her where you're going. Essentially, the goal at this point is just to keep Atreus safe and have Thor and Kratos' gay love remain undiscovered. So, Thor and Kratos, the two gods, and then Atreus, the half-god, they're just, skipping through Midgard, singing songs, and when Atreus falls asleep at night, Kratos and Thor go Brokeback Mountain on one another. There's actually an interactive sex scene between the two that occurs about 3/4 of the way through the game. The way that this works is it's not unlike the hot coffee mod for San Andreas. So essentially, from what I'm reading in the script, the scene is set up that Atreus is asleep and Thor has given him this almost like drink he made out of this root that's supposed to put him out for a bit, because he actually is getting more powerful. He needs to control his godhood, and he's getting very weak and very his power is like draining him of energy, so he needs to recover. And Thor and Kratos have a tent set up at a small campsite. They lock eyes, and then the two embrace one another in what is essentially the climax of the game, no pun intended. There's a very passionate kiss, and Kratos is already disrobed, but Kratos disrobes Thor. The two are standing nude in front of each other. Essentially, you have to prompt it with the controller, but they embrace, and surprisingly enough, Kratos is actually the submissive one in this relationship, but Thor penetrates Kratos and makes gentle yet passionate love to him in an interactive minigame. And that plays for about 20 minutes. You're hitting the button prompts, and you have to make sure you're hitting them right. Otherwise, you're not going to satisfy Thor enough. You'll get the game over screen. But after this interactive gay sex scene between two gods is done, then at that point, the plot starts wrapping up. So this is where I want to get a little bit more detailed as far as what the script was getting into, just because I want to make sure that you guys have a very thorough understanding, because there's about, I want to say 3 or 4 revelations that the game goes through. So you remember how God of War 2018 set it up like it was kind of like a soft reboot, and the events of the first 3 games still happened, but they weren't necessary to understand to enjoy the story? Well, God of War 2.5 Gods actually undoes that entire sequence of events. Essentially, the first 3 games didn't happen. This is set in a completely different universe. That's the first main twist, is that this is occurring in a completely different timeline. Okay, guys, and that's going to throw a lot of God of War fans off. But essentially, Kratos and Thor, this iteration of them, it blows open the doors on like the space-time continuum, and essentially there's multiple instances of these events taking place in different dimensions. So there's a Greek God of War, which is what we saw in the original trilogy. There's the 2018 God of War that we saw taking place in Midgard. There's the homosexual gay love between Thor and Kratos in this iteration, where Atreus is voiced by Charlie Sheen, and for some reason Ashton Kutcher shows up halfway through. And then there's other ones as well. There's one that takes place in Chinese mythology. There's one in Japanese mythology. Essentially, there's infinite different realms of different Kratoses going through different mythologies, which is actually a really interesting way to look at it. The second twist is that Atreus actually isn't isn't Kratos' son. So he was actually fathered by Joel from The Last of Us, who actually did have another kid in that 20-year gap between when his daughter got killed in the original Last of Us and when the game actually picks up for the majority. So this actually connects to The Last of Us. All right, so I know it's getting a little confusing. I don't want you guys to feel like you have to draw a map. Essentially, the gay love between Kratos and Thor is in the same universe that The Last of Us takes place in, just at a different time. All right, so again, there's different realms, but this actually is a direct tie-in with The Last of Us. And after Thor and Kratos and Atreus all discover this, at the same time they discover this tool where they can travel between the different realms. So then, in a brilliant stroke, I really got to say this, I don't know where they're coming up with this stuff over at Sony Santa Monica, but in a brilliant stroke, they transfer themselves to the time of The Last of Us. So just to recap, we've got Thor, we've got Kratos, and we've got Atreus, all time traveling to the setting of the original Last of Us game. And then at that point, Kratos actually, there's another sex minigame between him and Joel. So he's cheating on Thor, his gay god lover, with Joel from the original Last of Us game because he has to get pregnant with his son. And this leads us to the third and final twist of the game, all right, is that when you travel through time in these games, it doesn't erase the existing scenario. And you have to go back in time and make it right. So after Joel gives Kratos his seed, and after a terrible falling out between Thor and Kratos, after Thor discovers that Kratos cheated on him with Joel, Thor walks away, swearing up and down he's never going to see Kratos again. He's going to go get tested for some STDs. He hopes he dies in hell, etc., etc. Kratos is bestowed upon the revelation from Zeus, who appears in the sky, that he then has to go back in time to set the events of the original God of War 2018 game in motion. And this is the last twist, is that the mother in the original God of War, so Atreus' mom, the figure that we perceive as being Atreus' mom, is actually Kratos, the Kratos we're playing as in God of War 2.5 Gods, who went back in time to get impregnated with the seed from Joel that eventually becomes Atreus. So he then goes back to the original timeline set before God of War 2018, introduces himself to Kratos, tells him what's going on. So now we've got two Kratoses as two gay fathers to the unborn Atreus. And then after Kratos shits out Atreus and gives birth to his son, he sacrifices himself because he knows to set in forth the motion of events that eventually lead to this moment, he has to die. And that is why we never see the face of Atreus' quote-unquote mom in the original 2018 God of War. It's because it's actually Kratos from another timeline who got pregnant from Joel after cheating on Thor and going back in time. You see? And actually, this is going to throw a lot of God of War fans off. A lot of God of War fans are not going to like this change, but I personally love it, because it subverts your expectations in a way you never would have thought. And these three twists, I know it sounds like they're so spaced out the way I'm talking about them, but they hit like a 1-2 punch, except there's three of them in a row. So really, at that point, what they do is genius if you think about it. Now, the epilogue of the game, because there is an epilogue, the game essentially ends with Kratos killing himself. You have a button prompt. Remember, these are just Sony interactive movies. There's no gameplay. You hit a button prompt, so the time-traveling Kratos, who got pregnant by Joel, kills himself, and that sets in motion the events of the 2018 God of War game. Now, what I'm talking about so far really doesn't make up for more than about 2 hours of the gameplay. All right, everything I'm describing between Thor and going back in time and Joel and all of that shit, that takes about 2 hours. And because by the time that we're at this present moment in the game, all right, Kratos has sacrificed himself, the game actually is mainly comprised of the original God of War 2018 game all over again. It's just with the knowledge in your mind it completely changes the dynamic of the game, knowing that Kratos went back in time, had sex with a god and a man from another franchise. The Last of Us is canon in this universe. Charlie Sheen's canon in this universe. Ashton Kutcher's canon in this universe. Two Kratoses existing simultaneously, one bearing the unborn Atreus, and the two have to live in some homoerotic setting, but they can't engage with one another. There's so much sexual tension. There's just a lot here to unpack, guys. All right? So you then play through the 2018 God of War all over again. And this is another move that a lot of Sony fans may not like. But the bulk of what is on that disc, God of War Ragnarok, is the 2018 God of War all over again. It's just with the knowledge that nothing in that game was as it seems. And this is the genius of God of War 2.5 Gods, also known as God of War Ragnarok. Ragnarok is not this massive event that shakes everything to the core, and now we have this Thor versus Kratos rivalry that everyone's been speculating about since the events of the original game. No, that's not it. Ragnarok is the revelation that Kratos, a male god, was able to get pregnant from the seed of a character in another Sony franchise, shit out Atreus, and then set forth through his suicide the events of the 2018 God of War. Now, divisive? Absolutely. I can see this being as divisive as The Last Jedi. All right, there's just a lot of really off-the-wall stuff here. But I do believe that when this releases, because of these script details, that not only will God of War 2.5 Gods win the award for the Game of the Year, but I also believe that Charlie Sheen is going to win the voice award, the best voice actor for his portrayal of Atreus, because the kid he got in the original 2018 was kind of annoying. Charlie Sheen, if you go listen to something with his voice and you see Atreus, after you play this game, that is going to be the role that defines his career and the rest of his life. All right? Some are going to call that casting odd. It swings for me. And there's so many emotional moments in this game, such as the birds and the bees talk between Kratos and his son. And you know, yes, there's a few loose plot threads. The writers at Sony Santa Monica kind of abandoned the Freya plot. That doesn't really go anywhere. But the way that they bring this full circle is absolutely genius. And I think what we have here, I don't think it's quite an exaggeration to say that this could be a generation-defining game. And with it releasing so early in this generation, we don't normally see that type of stuff happen, you know, until late in a console's life. You think of the original 2018 God of War, that came out in 2018, 2 years before the generation was over. This is set to release in 2021, 2022 at the latest. So, you know, I think this is going to knock it out of the park. It's probably going to do significantly better than Horizon Forbidden West. From what I hear, they're playing it very safe with that game. There is a special after-credits scene. Essentially, they flash forward, I guess you could say, or backwards, depending on your perspective, to the scene in The Last of Us Part 2 where Joel gets his head bashed in. And if you think back, the first twist I mentioned was that there's multiple different dimensions with these events going on. Well, Joel, in another dimension, survived that scene with Abby, and he actually is coming for Atreus, his son. So he enters Atreus and Kratos' home in the same sequence of events that we saw Thor do at the original end credit scene of God of War 2018. Joel walks up, or he strolls up rather, with a golf club, knocks on the door. Kratos opens it up, his jaw hits the floor, and the game cuts to black. So we've got God of War 3, or whatever they're going to call the third installment in this new series, that's going to showcase this epic battle between these two separated parents of a god, both having experienced the loss in their families, both with passionate homoerotic love for one another across dimensions. And the way it's ended implies that there's either going to be a massive bloody brawl where only one of them is going to claim parentage over Atreus, or they're going to engage in long-awaited, eons of anticipation, anger sex. Quite frankly, I hope they go with the latter, but that remains to be seen. God of War, the third installment's probably several years out. Anyway, let me know if you guys think that this script leak is true or not. I'm honestly, I think that this is legitimate, because it sounds exactly like the thing that those geniuses over at Sony Santa Monica would come up with. It really does. So at the end of the day, I think we just got to ask ourselves, yes, take a step back. Do you think it's true? Do you not think it's true? But there's a lot here of substance. And there's a lot here that leads me to believe that this actually is what's going on. We've got every major plot point. It's going to subvert the expectations. I think that they've got a real winner on their hands this time, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I appreciate you guys watching, and I hope you have a truly wonderful day with the images of Charlie Sheen voicing Atreus, Kratos and Thor having passionate sex where Kratos is actually in the submissive role, and Joel spilling his seed into the anus of Kratos.